I want to take you on a journey back through time. Back before the mass popularisation of geek culture. Back before we all knew what a Comic-Con was. Back before we had big orchestras playing Doctor Who music. And even before the home media releases of Doctor Who itself. To the year 1983. For a very special and somewhat infamous event. This is the Doctor Who celebration in Longleat. And I want to tell you about all that went down and how it compares to modern conventions today. So sit back, relax, subscribe, and enjoy the journey. Okay, so the title is a little bit of a lie. There were small Doctor Who clubs that had existed since the late 1960s, and in fact by 1976, the BBC officially recognised the Doctor Who Appreciation Society as the official Doctor Who fan club, starting out with 70 members and rising to over 1,700 by 1982. And the Appreciation Society had ran small non-profit events for a number of years, but this paled in comparison to the burgeoning convention scene in the States, where due to BBC licensing out Doctor Who to PBS, Doctor Who was beginning to gain its footing in the American market, and with it came larger and, more importantly, for-profit events. And it was at one of these events that JNT pitched the idea of bringing these events to the UK to the head of BBC Enterprises, Terry Hampson, and his deputy, Lorne Martin. They were said to be impressed by its size, with over 5,000 attendees queuing for autographs, photos, and panels. I can only assume that the BBC Enterprises executives looked at all this and went, it was decided to do this as Doctor Who was heading into its 20th anniversary, and the three men felt that there needed to be something big to mark the occasion. But where to host such an event? Well, luckily, there was a certain tourist destination that had been the home of Doctor Who for a while. Longleat is a stately home dating back to the 16th century. It became a massively popular tourist destination as the result of its safari park, which opened in 1966, Longleat House itself, which largely houses artefacts from the building's history, and the Longleat Hedge Maze, which is considered one of the world's longest. Additionally, alongside all of this, a small Doctor Who exhibition had been running out of Longleat since 1973, and was one of the first permanent Doctor Who exhibition locations, well, until 2003 when it closed. Not to make any of you feel old, but that was the year I was born. In fact, I distinctly remember going to Longleat as a child once, and going around the back of one of the buildings and seeing an abandoned TARDIS door, and feeling kind of sad upon realising that there used to be Doctor Who stuff at Longleat that was there no longer. I kind of felt like I was missing out on something really cool. So it made sense to use Longleat as the host for a bigger event like the ones they hosted in America. The owner of Longleat, the Marquis of Bath, I had to Google what a Marquis was. A Marquis is essentially a British nobleman ranking above an earl and below a duke, was very keen to accommodate Doctor Who, seeing it as a major British achievement. Stating in the official commemorative programme sold alongside the event, quote, "My association with Doctor Who is far from new. I've always been a fan. After the first BBC costume exhibition was mounted in Longleat House in 1972, I was invited by the BBC Enterprises team to visit a temporary exhibition in London. I remember very well returning to Longleat that cold wintry day, determined that this should be the first stately home to accommodate the TARDIS. I had a stable block available, which was rapidly converted, and 10 years ago, the exhibition opened for the delight of one and all. This weekend is a culmination of the link between BBC Enterprises and myself. I congratulate them on their planning for the celebration, and even more, I congratulate everyone concerned with Doctor Who. For 20 years, they had a vision which has ensured that it had become one of the longest-running science fiction series in the world, a truly wonderful British achievement. So with the venue agreed, the date for the event was set on a bank holiday weekend of the 3rd and 4th of April, with weekend tickets costing £7 per adult. Adjusting for inflation, a weekend adult ticket would have set you back around £23.94, bearing in mind this didn't also include the entrance to Longleat itself and its separate attractions. This was just for the Doctor Who event. Originally, Doctor Who was only supposed to have one marquee alongside the existing exhibition. However, John Nathan Turner, ever the showman he was, and the team at BBC Enterprises realised that that would not be big enough for Doctor Who's 20th anniversary. So in the end, multiple attractions were housed in large tents across the grounds, including a makeup tent where kids could get their face painted like Doctor Who monsters, the radiophonic workshop tent with demonstrations of how Doctor Who sounds got produced, a costume tent showing off, well, various costumes from the TV show, studio sets taking you on tours through actual sets used on the TV show, a visual effects tent, which similarly to the radiophonic workshop, showed visual effects demonstrations, a charity auction of props hosted by Ian Levine, alongside a merchandise tent, which is probably most similar to the merchandise stalls you'll see in modern day conventions. Additionally, there were 2 photo opportunities, one with a TARDIS and a group of aliens, and one with Bessie, the yellow car from the 3rd Doctor's era, panels where various guests of the convention would talk to the crowds, the Longleat Orangery, which was transformed into an autograph area for the various stars in attendance, and a Doctor Who cinema tent, which, as the name implies, would be showing various Doctor Who episodes throughout the day. This was significant because this was long before home video became readily available, so for many, this was their first time re-experiencing these episodes since broadcast. This is all on top of the existing Doctor Who exhibition, which was still running over this weekend, as well as the regular Longleat attractions such as the Safari Park. So suffice to say, there was a lot to do at Longleat on this day. And something I love about this convention is that it seems to be kind of a blend between what we would consider a modern convention, you know, signings, photograph opportunities, that kind of thing, but combined with a more educational element, which I actually really like. The idea of showing radiophonic workshop demonstrations and visual effects demonstrations is really fun, and it kind of felt like it was more of a general experience that anyone could enjoy rather than just Doctor Who fans themselves, which I think is a really cool element that maybe potentially got lost a little bit on future conventions. As someone who goes to conventions fairly regularly, I've never quite seen anything of this scale and with this much stuff to do for everyone of all ages. And that's without mentioning what guests would be in attendance. All the surviving Doctors attended, including Tom Baker. Many of the companions and other characters were also very easy to get to attend, as a result of the fact that they all just come off of filming the 5 Doctors. So they hadn't found new work yet, so it was very easy to just get them to go and do this event over a weekend. The most hesitant was Patrick Troughton, who was relatively private at the time, but was eventually convinced by JNT and John Pertwee to come along. Something I also find very cool is that Heather Hartnell, the widow of William Hartnell, was also at the event to ensure that her husband's memory wasn't forgotten among the 20th anniversary celebrations, which I just think is really nice. As for companions, as I said, most of the cast of the 5 Doctors were there, so Carol Ann Ford, Liz Sladen, Mark Strickson, Sarah Sutton, Janet Fielding, Anthony Ainley, in this picture that I absolutely love, and Nicholas Courtney. So you might be saying, Tharies, why have you called this convention a disaster in your title? It sounds like a really awesome time, and from everything I've seen, it probably was, for those who got in. For you see, the BBC vastly underestimated the amount of people who would attend the event. They were expecting 20,000 people to attend the event across the weekend, which is still a relatively big figure. They were quite shocked, however, when nearly triple that arrived across the weekend, despite the fact that the marketing budget was relatively low, mainly just being advertised alongside the actual show in things like Radio Times, alongside the Doctor Who Appreciation Society magazines. It got to a point where Radio 1, who were covering the events of Longleat, were basically telling people to turn around and go back home because the traffic was getting so bad. And there are multiple stories of people who travelled down from all different places who were unable to actually get into the event. Things weren't all sunshine and rainbows in the actual event either, as the main activity for many people at Longleat seemed to be that old traditional British pastime, queuing. Queues for basically everything ran on for ages, particularly things like the studio sets. The queues outside were getting so bad that Peter Davison and Tom Baker went out into the crowds to greet fans to try and calm the rage. And Mark Strickson commandeered Bessie and drove it down the queues and started talking to everyone, try and keep them all in good spirits. Which is something that I really appreciate, given that they didn't have to do that. You know, they weren't being paid to do anything extra. They did it because it was the right thing to do, and I just think that's lovely. Another way they attempted to mitigate the queues was with one John Leeson, the voice of K9, who in character would tell people what things were the most busy, what to avoid, and when to stop queuing. This, however, did frustrate a young Nicholas Briggs, who was trying to watch the Doctor Who episodes in the Doctor Who cinema, and went over to his booth and basically told him to stop. Nicholas Briggs was also carrying a recorder and attempting to record these Doctor Who episodes, so K9's voice blaring over the speakers every 5 minutes annoyed him even more. It's a neat little precursor to what he would eventually do for Big Finish. In terms of other future Doctor Who alumni, reportedly both Paul Cornell and Russell T Davies were also in attendance over the weekend. Another strange aspect of the event was the security. They actually got full-on army members for security. This is because Longleat was situated not too far away from a local garrison town, and getting people to work on a bank holiday was difficult, so they decided to use the army. This could somewhat create a slightly uncomfortable atmosphere as Doctor Who fans were slightly shoved around by these army men. But as Mark Strickson points out in the documentary that I'm using for a lot of the research in this video, Greatest Show in the Galaxy, they weren't really trained to do that. Something else that was funny about the soldiers that were patrolling the grounds is that they were dressed specifically as unit soldiers in order to maintain the theme. It's at this convention that we also see the beginnings of another hobby that would become traditional for Doctor Who fans and geek culture across the world: cosplay, as several people turned up dressed as different doctors and characters from the show. And I think there's just something very charming about seeing these activities that weren't common at the time. You've got to remember that this is before the absolute explosion of geek culture in the early 2000s. Doctor Who in particular was seen as a relatively freakish obsession by many, so the idea of going to a place full of Doctor Who fans and everything you'd ever want to see was a very appealing prospect for many. By the second day, many of the cast were exhausted. However, there was one additional attraction added later on, and that was the sets from the 5 Doctors, which they still needed up till the Thursday before the weekend of the Longleat convention. Everyone could see not only the Gallifreyan Council room where the Doctor interacts with them before heading back into the Death Zone, but also the TARDIS console room alongside Chameleon. Of course, people were told not to touch, but everyone did anyway. And to be honest, I can't blame them. I may have done a similar thing at the Doctor Who experience back in the day. Overall, in spite of the chaos, those who did attend seemed to really admire just how much effort had been put into the event. And as someone who wasn't there, but as someone who knows more modern conventions, part of me can't help but love the charm of an event that, well, yes, they sold tickets to, seemed a lot less corporate and a lot more fan-driven than the conventions that we've gone on to see since. As a result of the hecticness of this event, BBC Enterprises never decided to host another event for the entirety of the classic series, which makes sense on their end. It was a bit of a logistical nightmare. However, part of me can't help but feel that that's slightly a shame, as now most conventions are ran by third parties, and don't get me wrong, I enjoy a good amount of them, but there's something so cool about the fan-driven nature of the Doctor Who Longleat convention. The Doctor Who Appreciation Society had a whole stall. Actors would go around signing autographs for free, and would take extra time out of their days to get to people who wouldn't be able to get into the event. And in the age of the hyper-expensive modern convention going, where it is just one in, one out, there's something special about that to me. And as I said before, I think the educational element is a really cool part of this event that we just don't really see anymore. The idea of seeing live demonstrations of sounds that came from Doctor Who, or having your face painted like an alien as a kid, it harkens back to a time where Doctor Who was more of a show for everyone, whereas now I would argue it's more of a kind of tight-knit community, which is not bad in and of itself, but I think there's something cool about having a Doctor Who event available to everyone. It's the same reason I like the Doctor Who experience, is that was something that, even if you weren't a fan of Doctor Who, was just cool to see. Whereas now, with the modern conventions, it's very rare that you'll have people who go to those that aren't die-hard fans or parents begrudgingly being dragged along, which, don't get me wrong, I assume was probably the case for this as well, but it seemed like there was more for those people than there are at modern Comic-Cons and things like that. All that being said though, in the days following the event, there were some absolutely wonderful headlines written by the tabloids, including my personal favourite, Dr. Q, as a joke as to how much queuing there was at the event. But for a first attempt of an official BBC convention, I admire the ambition of it. It could have very easily just been a marquee with some old props and a couple of autograph tables, but they went above and beyond to make something truly unique here, and I have to respect that. And I can't imagine how mind-blowing it would have been to see all these actors and all these props and costumes in one place at one time, for many for the first time. So if you have any memories of the Doctor Who Longleat convention in 1983, or indeed the longer running Doctor Who exhibition at Longleat, please let me know. This video was a ton of fun to research, and I want to thank a couple of sources where I got my inspiration from. The main one being the Greatest Show in the Galaxy Longleat Doctor Who documentary, which was by Real Time, which I will link in the description below if you want to learn more about this event. There's stuff I didn't cover here, which they go into more detail in over there. As well as I want to thank the Doctor Who Companion, DoctorWhoLongleat.com, and Andrew O'Day for additional photos of the event. Thanks all for watching, and I'll see you later.